Olivia Orton lived with her ordinary parents in a house in an ordinary town. Olivia went to a school and had a best friend called Sam. With her messy brown hair, her pale brown eyes hidden behind thick glasses, and her drab clothes, Olivia looked quite ordinary too. The other girls at school teased her for this, saying, "Ordinary Olivia, don't you wish you could be like us, with our shiny blonde hair and big blue eyes? You are far too ordinary to be our friend." It wasn't just the girls that would tease poor Olivia. The boys were just as rude. The boys would hide behind the school doors and trip Olivia up when she came walking down the corridor. They would pull her hair and steal her books. And there was one boy in particular who was especially mean. His name was Callum, and he would hide behind the hedges as Olivia was walking home from school and throw small stones at her. Olivia's best friend Sam would use his school bag to try to block the stones and protect Olivia as much as possible, but he would often end up getting hit with them instead.
"Ordinary Olivia,"
Callum would shout out.
"You're so ordinary and boring." "Don't listen to them, Olivia,"
Sam would say.
"You're smart and funny and so much fun to be around. Don't let the bullies hurt you."
Olivia would tighten her lips and keep quiet, continuing to walk home. This carried on happening over the years, from primary school to middle school to high school. It wasn't easy to ignore the bullies, but Olivia had a secret. Olivia wasn't actually so ordinary after all. Every night, once the clock struck midnight, Olivia's body would start to sparkle. She would sit up in her bed, and in just a few seconds, she would completely transform. Gone was her ordinary brown hair, the messy tangles replaced with bouncing blonde curls. Gone were the thick glasses and brown eyes, and in their place were sparkling bright green eyes instead. Gone were the dull clothes, with Olivia being dressed in a sleek pink superwoman's outfit instead. Olivia didn't just look like a superwoman, she actually had a few superpowers too. Not only could she fly, but she had super strong hearing and eyesight and had the physical strength of 20 men. Nobody else in the world knew about Olivia's secret, and if she told anyone, her superpowers would disappear. This had been happening for years now, ever since the very first day that Olivia was bullied. Ever since then, Olivia had been putting her superpowers to good use. Every night after her transformation, Olivia would stand at the edge of her bedroom window and take a big leap out. Rather than crashing into the bushes below, Olivia would push her body upwards and would go soaring through the sky. She would make her way to the clock tower at the center of town, where she had the perfect view of everything going on in the town below. Tonight, she could see a few seagulls pecking their way through the streets, fighting with each other whenever one of them found a particularly tasty morsel. She could also see a few men walking home from the restaurants, laughing and joking with each other. Olivia sat back and smiled. "It looks as though tonight is going to be a calm and quiet night," she said to herself. It wasn't long before this all changed. In the distance, Olivia could hear a woman shouting. The woman was very far away, but Olivia's super strong hearing meant that she could hear every word. "Leave me alone!" cried the woman.
"Give me that bag,"
a man's voice shouted.
"Give it to me now, or I'll kill you."
"Please," begged the woman. "I'll be left with no food and no money if you take my bag." Olivia waited no more. She looked in the direction of the voices she could hear, stretched her arms, and flew up into the clouds. She reached the sky above the voices in just 2 seconds, and she could hear the woman continuing to plead with the man. Olivia looked down and could see the man reaching out to grab the bag. The woman was old and couldn't hold on to the bag. Once the man had snatched the bag from her, he turned and started to run. However, he had only taken 3 steps when something came shooting down at him from above. It was Olivia. She pushed the man backwards so that he fell onto the ground and grabbed the woman's bag from him. With one boot on the man's chest so that he couldn't move, Olivia handed the bag back to the old woman. "Oh, thank you so much, my dear," the woman said gratefully, clutching onto Olivia's hand. "How will I ever repay you?" "Repay me by promising to be kind to all those around you," replied Olivia. I will, promised the old woman. Olivia turned to the man on the ground. "Should I call the police?" Olivia asked him.
Please don't,
sobbed the man.
I'm so sorry for what I did. I won't do anything like that ever again.
"If you do, I'll be watching you," said Olivia, "and I won't be so forgiving the next time." He turned to Olivia and said,
Thank you so much. I promise I'll be good.
before running away. Olivia flew back to the clock tower, but slowly this time, admiring the view of the town below. The rest of the night was quiet, and Olivia spent some time napping under the stars. Just before the clock hit 5 a.m., Olivia flew back to her house and back into her bed. As 5 a.m. struck, Olivia sparkled once again. Another transformation was taking place. This time, Olivia's bouncing blonde curls were replaced with messy brown tangles. Her bright green eyes were swapped back to her brown eyes and thick glasses, and her superwoman outfit was replaced with her dull clothes. Olivia lay back in bed, closed her eyes, and went to sleep for a while, until it was time to wake up for school that morning. The next day at school was no different to any of the others. All the girls and the boys picked on Olivia, shouting, "Get lost, ordinary Olivia! We don't want you near us!" As usual, Callum was especially mean. Whenever Olivia would go near him, he would reach out and pinch her arm so hard that it brought tears to her eyes.
We don't like you, ordinary Olivia.
Callum snarled.
Ignore them, Olivia.
Sam would say, pulling her away from the laughing crowd.
You're anything but ordinary. Don't let anyone take that beautiful sparkle away from your eyes.
Olivia turned away, thinking about all of the adventures that the night would hold for her instead. That night, just as always, the clock struck midnight and Olivia transformed. She flew to the clock tower, but before she even got there, she could hear someone shouting.
Help! Somebody, please, help!
Olivia immediately turned in the air and flew to the voice. As she got nearer, she could see someone caught under a fallen tree. In one quick move, Olivia swooped down from the sky, grabbed hold of the tree and pulled it away. She flew back down to the ground to see if the person who was trapped was okay. When Olivia saw who it was, she couldn't believe her eyes. It was Callum, the boy who was so mean to her at school. Callum stared at her with wide eyes. This was the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. Of course, he didn't know that this superwoman was actually Olivia.
What's your name?
Stuttered Callum. Olivia said nothing. She didn't want to speak to the boy who was so rude to her. Instead, she swooped back into the sky and flew away. The next night, just as Olivia reached the clock tower, she heard a shouting voice.
I need help. Is there anyone who can help me? Please, hurry!
Olivia immediately flew in the direction of the voice and saw that it was coming from someone high up in a tree.
I'm stuck and I can't get down. Please, help me,
the voice said. Olivia slowed down in the air. She recognized the voice. It belonged to Callum, the bully. Still, Olivia believed in being kind to everyone, so she flew to Callum, lifted him off the tree, and brought him gently back down to the ground.
Thank you so much,
said Callum.
Please tell me your name.
Olivia said nothing, looking at the tree instead. She was starting to get suspicious. If Callum could climb up the tree, then surely he could climb back down the tree. It was quite an easy tree to climb. Olivia ignored Callum and flew back into the air, returning to the clock tower. Just a few minutes later, she heard some more shouting.
Help! Please, help!
This time, she recognized the voice immediately but didn't move. She wasn't going to help Callum any longer. She knew that he was getting stuck on purpose because he wanted to see Olivia again, but she also knew that he only liked her for the way she looked. Soon, the shouting stopped, and it wasn't long before Olivia could see Callum making his way through the streets back to his home. The next night, Olivia was back at the clock tower. It was a rainy and windy night, but Olivia was still determined to put her superpowers to good use. Suddenly, Olivia heard two shouting voices. Olivia tried to hear what they were saying, but even with her super strong hearing, the wind was too loud and she couldn't quite understand. Olivia flew in the direction of the voices, and soon realized that they were coming from different places.
Somebody help me!
Screamed one voice.
I'm so scared. Can anyone help me?
Shouted the other. Olivia knew that the first voice belonged to Callum, and the other voice belonged to someone who really needed help. Olivia quickly flew in the direction of the second voice, and soon reached the beach. She looked down and saw her best friend Sam drowning in the waves.
Help! Help! Help!
Cried Sam, his voice getting quieter as he started to get weaker while struggling to stay above the water. Olivia didn't waste any time. Sam was the only person she truly cared about. She wouldn't be able to bear it if anything happened to him. She flew down and grabbed Sam around his waist, pulling him out of the waves and flying him over to the sandy beach nearby. She sat him down on the sand and waited until he had caught his breath. "Sam, I'm so glad you're okay," Olivia cried out.
Who are you? How do you know my name?
Sam asked her, looking confused. Olivia looked into her best friend's eyes, wanting to tell him the truth but afraid to lose her superpowers. Sam stared back into Olivia's eyes, watching them sparkle. As he watched, he recognized her.
Olivia? Is that you?
He gasped. Olivia said nothing.
I recognize those eyes,
said Sam.
They might not be the same color, but they have the same sparkle. I would know it was you no matter what you look like, Olivia. I've been in love with you since the very first day we met.
Olivia smiled and gave Sam a huge hug. Me too, Sam, replied Olivia happily. I was so scared when I thought I was going to lose you. Let's not waste another day spending time apart. Olivia reached out for Sam's hand, and as their hands met, her body began to sparkle. A transformation was taking place. Gone were the bouncing blonde curls, but instead of being replaced with messy brown tangles, sleek and shiny brown hair appeared instead. Her blue eyes went back to being brown, but Olivia no longer needed glasses, and her dull clothes were replaced with the finest of fashion. Olivia had grown up. Gone were Olivia's superpowers too, but Olivia didn't mind. I have you now, Sam, said Olivia, and I don't need superpowers. Sam held Olivia close, happier than he had ever been.
You're extraordinary, Olivia,
he whispered to his love. Soon after that, Olivia and Sam were married, and the two lived happily ever after. The end.